How many of you believe that Congress is doing a good job? If you didn't raise your hand, then you're in the majority. Only 22% of people approve of the work that Congress is doing right now. I believe that Congress is stagnant and is not evolving with modern times and technology. Some believe that having term limits would get rid of many of the issues that people have today with incumbent politicians. That's why I think that the Committee on the Judiciary should implement term limits to stop career politician abuse over our congressional system. Let's begin. Career politicians are a misrepresentation of their community. There are too many incentives to keep seats and not allow a new candidate to be elected. An article by B. Shepard in October 24th, 2017 over term limits and how they could transform Congress. Congress isn't adequately representing citizens. Data from the Pew Research Center shows that recent sessions of Congress have been among the least productive in history. And because of the lack of term limits, older members of Congress continue to hold the spotlight and stimulate new debate. These real concerns show the time for term limits has arrived. I think this is especially true in today's time, since a recent poll done shows that 74% of Americans support term limits. I believe that politicians are chosen by the party to sit as a representative and not as a representative of the people. An article by D. Greenberry on term limits, The Only Way to Clean Up Congress, states that term limits would ameliorate many of America's most serious political problems by counterbalancing incumbent advantages, ensuring congressional turnover, securing independent congressional judgment, and reducing election-related incentives for wasteful government spending. That is a quote by Dan Greenberry, who is a political analyst, and explains how adding term limits would give Congress a sense of rigidity and more drive when in office to get things done. Secondly, in my argument for the Committee on the Judiciary is about super PACs. Super PACs is a kind of a loophole right now in the campaign donation process, which can help sway votes. Super PACs and big corporations can sway votes by donating huge amounts of money for politician campaigns using outside corporations that have agendas and try to sway politicians one way or the other based on like what would get them farthest ahead in whatever field they're in, whether it be energy or medicine or pharmaceutical companies. They all have lobbyists in Washington. Which brings me on to my next point. It's about super PACs. It was written in November 13th, 2019. It says, as of April 7th, 2019, 1,720 groups organized as super PACs have reported total receipts of $577 million and total independent expenditures of $104 million in the 2020 cycle, which means basically that almost $500 million or over $500 million has been spent in just swaying these politicians to whichever way they would want. And that money goes towards buying signs, posters, getting them TV time, everything. Lobbying can change the public's perception on a candidate overnight. Many politicians turn around and become lobbyists afterwards and join in the wealth that is present and continue to affect votes even after they are out of office, which is supported by a quote written by R. Berman in 2018, which is the article's title in The Atlantic is An Exodus from Congress, Test to the Law of Lobbying. Of the nearly 4 lawmakers who left office after the 2016 election, 1/4 stayed in Washington and 1 in 6 became lobbyists. Lobbying remains the single most popular post-Congress career choice for retiring members. While it seems that many of our lawmakers are staying in Washington to keep swaying votes, some people say that on the other side of the argument, getting rid of term limits can create its own set of problems. They can allow negative change in the system, which is supported by a peer-reviewed speech titled Why Americans Hate Politics and Politicians. Congress has an all-time low approval rating, and they seemingly don't care. Some believe that adding a term limit would have long-term effects on the outcomes of congressional votes. While that's the extent of the article, I think that what they're trying to say is that people, or the politicians, they might see this like they only have 8 years or they only have 12 years and they would want to make more rash votes because there's no repercussions, I suppose, towards their next reelection when they know they're done. Kind of like the president in his second term, when before he gets out, he makes executive rules or lets prisoners go that he normally wouldn't have done in his first month. But that's because at that point, they have no reason to care for their approval rating and so on and so forth. Another point is that they deny voters the right to keeping a politician they find fair in office. So authors like Michael Nelson realize this as he talks in his book. The framers of the Constitution, whose handiwork the reformers wished to undo, did not think term limits were a positive rule. they explicitly rejected term limits. Even though such limits had been the practice under the Articles of Confederation, they rejected them because they thought that term limits would be bad for voters they'd be bad for voters who would be denied even the opportunity to keep good legislators in Congress. My last point is the proposal for the Committee of the Judiciary is that of a congressional refresh policy. I believe that we should let congressmen get two terms, and then they have to wait a certain period before being allowed the potential to run again if desired. President Trump actually in 2016 brought up something similar to this, in which he said, "The time for congressional term limits has finally come. Not only will it end our government corruption, but we will end the economic stagnation that we're in right now." And I believe this was right after the Congress had failed to pass a law regarding a tariff on China. And many believe it was because of the money that comes from these super PACs that possibly would be donating to a congressman, which even though like you think that with all the laws regarding like foreign interference in elections, there's still a ton of research that shows that it happens. And even though Trump has not yet followed through on his promise due to the complex nature of this issue, many believe that he will push towards it in the final months of his second term, or in his maybe final few months in office here. And I believe that policy change would allow legislators to obtain office to serve their community. Of the total members of the 115th Congress, over 194 of them are declared public servants by occupation, and the entirety of their job consists of political office. Many of them are former mayors, governors, ambassadors, etc. And I believe this is actually not what the Founding Fathers had in mind for its legislative body. They wanted Congress to be safe in the hands of many, and I think that stuff like political parties and super PACs do exactly the opposite, and instead place the power into the hands of two groups or 100 corporations, the rich and the powerful. I believe they look over the people who actually need help in this country. Let's read about my final quote by KJ Larson in 2012, written in an article, "Republican Revolutionaries and Tea Party Patriots." It is difficult to overstate the extent to which term limits would change Congress. They're supported by large majorities of most American demographic groups. They are opposed primarily by incumbent politicians and the special interest groups in which they depend on them. I think that was a good quote to finish on, because it kind of talks about how like it's not just how it's going to change in Congress and how it's going to change their lawmaking decisions and how it's affected by everyone, whether that's the politicians, that's the people that they are supposed to represent, and or the interest groups, which would be the super PACs. Which brings me to my conclusion. In conclusion, I believe Congress is stagnant and is not evolving with modern times and technology. They need new legislation in place to become an effective governing body. This is why I believe the Committee on the Judiciary should implement term limits to stop career politician abuse over our congressional system.